One moment of high drama during last year's general election campaign frequently gets forgotten. It happened during the one occasion when Theresa May and Philip Hammond shared a platform. After an opening presentation that had revealed little about the Conservatives' plans for the economy, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor reluctantly invited questions. BBC's Laura Kuenssberg went first. Would Philip Hammond still be in a job after the general election? There was a long, awkward silence. This, above all else, was the question that was on everyone's mind. It was well known there was no love lost between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and that May had only appointed him out of political expediency. As it was then generally assumed that May would win the election at a canter, everyone rather expected her to use her increased majority to get rid of the Chancellor she detested. A more media-savvy Prime Minister might have seen that question coming and prepared an answer that didn't make it immediately apparent that the two most powerful people in government loathed one another. She could have just lied and said that Hammond had her full support, that the economy was getting back on its feet under the Conservatives. Anything to present a show of unity. But May couldn't bring herself to say even that. Instead, there was a long silence before she muttered something non-committal about waiting to see if she won the election before deciding on her cabinet. Hammond turned even more ashen than usual. He could read the use of language and realized he had effectively been given his P45 on national television. Come the election, he would be back in the political wilderness. Rarely has there been a more confusing time to be a man. It didn't quite turn out that way, of course. After one of the more hapless election campaigns, getting May to run a presidential-style campaign based on personality and charisma was always asking for trouble. The Conservatives ended up weaker than before with no overall majority in Parliament. May had to rip up her plans to ruthlessly purge all those she disliked and appoint a cabinet based more on consensus and expediency. May's failure ensured that Hammond kept his job. Nothing has happened since the election to ease the tensions between the Prime Minister and her Chancellor. At best they coexist uneasily, at worst their mutual suspicion verges on open distrust. Never more so than now as Hammond prepares to deliver what many believe will be his third and final budget. Most expect May to be gone by this time next year, and if she goes, then Hammond is certain to go with her. A new Prime Minister will want a new Chancellor. The stakes were raised still further for this year's budget when May used her leader's speech at the Tory party conference in Birmingham to declare that the years of austerity were over. Hammond looked aghast. He knew only too well that the general public didn't feel as if austerity was over at all. The Tory cuts to public spending of the past 8 years were still hurting people's standards of living badly. People didn't feel any better off, rather they felt that public services were in decline and that inequality was rising. Hammond, a natural connoisseur, is now tasked with making the country feel better about itself, but Hammond had been given his instructions and he had to deliver. The Chancellor has always been careful not to repeat the Prime Minister's hostage to fortune, austerity is over line. The most he can bring himself to say is that our best days lie ahead. Hardly an inspiring call to arms, as its underlying message is that things are a bit rubbish now. Nonetheless, Hammond, a natural connoisseur, is now tasked with making the country feel better about itself ahead of the 29th of March next year when Britain leaves the EU. Brexit might leave Ireland and Northern Ireland in different time zones. May wants to give the impression that Brexit will be full of good things, so the Chancellor has to turn on the spending taps. Several months ago, the Prime Minister announced that an extra £20 billion per year would be found for the NHS, and in recent pre-budget leaks, more money has also been pledged for building more roads and planting trees, and cash is likely to be made available to offset the worst of the damage caused by the failures in implementation of universal credit. Just how he is going to pay for all these spending commitments is another matter. The devil will be in the detail of the Red Book, and it will be only when the Institute for Fiscal Studies has gone through the numbers on Tuesday lunchtime that we will see whether the Chancellor has indulged in fantasy economics. Either way, the Chancellor looks caught between two stools. Labour will quite rightly argue that whatever he has promised won't be enough to justify May's insistence that austerity is over, and Hammond, who has made a virtue of fiscal prudence, will now be hated by some Tories for introducing tax increases or ridiculed by others for increasing the deficit. Hammond is damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. Then, there's Brexit itself. In an astonishing interview with Sophie Ridge on Sky on Sunday morning, the Chancellor admitted that his budget was only just about credible if the UK managed to achieve a good enough deal with the EU. If Britain were to crash out with a no deal, then all bets were off. The budget would have to be ripped up and he would have to start again with an emergency budget. One that would almost certainly turn the UK into the low-tax, low-regulation economy that the Tories had always promised they would never do. If a no deal is a genuine possibility, then the government had literally no economic plan for dealing with it. It was a staggering admission on Hammond's part, one that indicated the budget he was delivering on Monday was only his best guess. A hint-and-hope budget that might just about fly if nothing rocked the boat too vigorously. And certainly not a ringing endorsement of the government's economic competence. But it was also one that damaged the impression the Tories had been trying to give that they were prepared for a no-deal scenario. Or that no deal was better than a bad deal. Hammond had given the game away. If, as seems increasingly likely given the current state of the negotiations and the infighting within the Tory party, a no deal is a genuine possibility, then the government had literally no economic plan for dealing with it. The budget he had delivered this November would be dead in the water and it would be back to square one. So better a bad deal than a no deal. The time to panic may be closer than we thought. Read more. Theresa May's dancing gets NUL points from Europe, and so does the Chequers deal. Nick Clegg's Facebook job shows he loves power more than progress. Why Brexit and the Northern Ireland border issue remains centre stage.